Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight I want to take you on a journey far away from modern comfort, deep into the heart of the Middle Ages. The title of our story is How Did People Sleep in Wooden Huts During Brutal Medieval Winters? Now before we dive in, if you find yourself drawn into this world, give this video a like, hit that follow button, and let's keep exploring history together. Imagine for a moment stepping outside on a January night in the year 1350. There is no hum of electricity, no glow of street lamps, not even the faintest comfort of glass windows reflecting light from within. The world is black, deep, and unbroken, except for the stars hidden behind heavy clouds. The air cuts into your lungs, sharp and merciless, the kind of cold that makes every breath feel like a knife. Your boots crunch in the snow, and ahead of you stands a hut, not a house by our standards, not a cozy cabin, but a survival box, thrown together from timber, clay, straw, and whatever else could be scraped from the land. This is where people lived, ate, prayed, and most importantly for us tonight, slept. The hut looks humble, almost fragile, leaning against the wind. Its walls are made of wattle and daub-woven sticks plastered with mud and dung, patched again and again when cracks open to the weather. The roof is thatched, groaning under the weight of snow. The door is just a wooden plank, warped from damp. No lock, but a wooden latch. No true barrier against whatever might roam outside. Step inside, and the first thing that hits you is not sight, but smell. Smoke, heavy and acrid, clings to your hair, seeps into your clothes, burns your eyes. The hearth sits at the center, fire banked low, embers glowing faintly red beneath a blanket of ash. There is no chimney, just a hole in the roof, where smoke curls upward, though most of it hangs in the air, stinging your throat. That smoke, though suffocating, is life itself. It keeps meat from rotting, drives away insects, and maybe, just maybe, holds back unseen spirits that villagers fear creep in with the cold. Now your eyes adjust, and you begin to see the world inside. A dirt floor, damp and uneven, covered in straw that has flattened and darkened with use. The straw is bedding, carpet, and sometimes even table, all in one. Along the edges of the hut are rough benches, baskets of grain, wooden bowls, maybe a stool, if the family is fortunate. But what truly defines the space is the crowd. Families were not small in the Middle Ages, and even if they were, no one slept alone in winter. Here, 10 or more bodies huddled together, pressed into one bedding heap of straw, hides, and patched quilts. Father, mother, children, grandparents, sometimes even cousins or neighbors, when storms rage too fiercely for anyone to remain alone. And if you listen closely, you hear the sounds that never stop: coughs, snores, rustling straw, the faint murmur of prayers, the grunt of the pig tied in the corner, the restless stamping of a goat, the flutter of hens roosting overhead. Privacy doesn't exist here. Your father's breath, your sister's elbow, your brother's mutter in his sleep, all of it belongs to everyone. Sleep is not solitary, it is shared. But how exactly did people sleep in this crowded, smoky world? Today we talk about 8 hours of unbroken rest, about sleep hygiene and circadian rhythms. Back then, the night was too long for one stretch of sleep. In the deep winters of Northern Europe, darkness could last 14 hours or more, and so people slipped into segmented sleep, They would close their eyes soon after dusk, bodies dropping from exhaustion into what they called their first sleep. Hours later, they would stir. Some woke fully, some only half. This in-between time was accepted, even expected. Fathers added fuel to the fire. Mothers nursed babies or prepared dough by ember light. Children scratched at fleas or whispered to each other under quilts. Neighbors sometimes visited one another, trudging through snow with a lantern, sharing ale or quiet talk before heading back to their own huts. Monks wrote prayers for these hours, believing the soul was closest to heaven when the world was darkest. Doctors described first sleep and second sleep in their texts, as though it were as normal as breathing. To them, broken sleep was not a problem, it was life. And so imagine lying there after first sleep, the embers glowing red, shadows crawling across smoke-stained rafters. You hear your father cough, harsh and deep. His lungs rattled from years of breathing this same air. You feel your sister shifting beside you, scratching at her arm where fleas bite. You smell the pig in the corner, the sour straw beneath you, the musk of sweat in the quilts above. Your mother hums a lullaby, low and steady, words barely audible, but comforting nonetheless. Not a sweet nursery rhyme, but a song about frost spirits kept away by saints, about wolves driven off by brave shepherds. These songs are half prayer, half lesson, teaching children not to stray from the bedding, not to let fear win. The night is long, the danger's real, but the melody makes it manageable. When people drift back into their second sleep, it is not comfort that carries them, but necessity. Straw itches, flattened in places, so the cold earth presses against your hip. The quilt is patched from scraps of old tunics, dyed with onion skins or walnut husks. Heavy, but imperfect. If someone pulls it too far, the draft sneaks in and needles your skin like ice. You tug it back, your brother grumbles, your cousin kicks, and yet no one dares keep it to themselves. Warmth must be shared, even if it means discomfort. That's the unspoken law. Survival is never selfish, and through it all, fire remains the center of life. Relighting a fire from scratch in winter is difficult, sometimes impossible without tinder, so embers are treated like treasure. Each night, fathers bank the fire with ash or even dung mixed with straw, letting it smolder until dawn. The glow beneath the ash is more than heat, it is heartbeat, proof that the hut still lives. Some families whispered, "Thanks to the fire," speaking to it as though it were another member of the household. And perhaps it was. Without it, the hut becomes a tomb. With it, there is another chance at morning. Of course, fear was never far away. Outside, wolves prowled, driven closer to villages by hunger. Tales told of travelers dragged into the forest, their fate marked only by paw prints in snow. Raiders, too. Haunted dreams. Hungry men desperate enough to steal food or burn huts even in midwinter. The flimsy plank of a door was no true defense. So parents told stories of saints outwitting wolves, of charms of iron or juniper keeping spirits at bay, of prayers rising with the smoke to heaven itself. Were these tales true? It didn't matter. They gave courage, and courage was as necessary as quilts or fire. And so each night followed the same fragile rhythm. First, sleep, waking. Second, sleep. Prayers whispered into smoke, quilts patched from scraps pulled tighter, straw flattened but endured, fleas biting but ignored, hunger gnawing but softened with crusts of bread or sips of ale shared before bed. Every sound, every smell, every discomfort became part of the lullaby of survival. And when dawn finally came, when gray light slipped through the cracks in the roof and roosters crowed, believed to chase away spirits with their cry, there was relief. Not joy, not comfort, but relief. Another night had been endured. Another day had been won. So how did people sleep in wooden huts during brutal medieval winters? They slept in fragments, in crowds, in smoke, in fear, and in hope. They slept not to dream, not to refresh, but to endure. And in that endurance lies the truth of the human spirit. We do not always need comfort. We need survival. And survival, even in its roughest form, can hold a strange kind of beauty. The embers pulse faintly in the hearth, no bigger than a heartbeat. Your father stirs again, shoulders stooped, his hand reaching for the iron poker. He leans forward, careful not to wake too many, and nudges the ash just enough to expose a soft red glow. He doesn't feed it much, just a stick, maybe a scrap of kindling, because wood is precious. Every log counted, every twig accounted for. But the tiny breath of fire that rises is enough to remind the family that warmth still waits beneath the ash. In this hut, the fire is more than tool. It is guardian, it is companion, it is life itself. Think about it: without matches, without lighters, without the easy spark we take for granted, making fire from nothing was exhausting. Flint and steel could produce sparks, but in damp, smoky air, coaxing those sparks into flame was trial and error, sometimes hours long. And so, families treated fire like gold. They banked it at night, covered it with ash or dung to slow its breath, whispered prayers over it, even carried embers from house to house if one family's hearth went cold. In some villages, brides carried coals from their mother's hearth into their new homes, as though fire itself was an heirloom. Can you imagine starting your marriage by carrying the living flame of your childhood into your new life? That's how deep fire ran in their bones. But warmth was never steady. Drafts crept through cracks in the walls, stinging cheeks, numbing toes. Quilts patched from scraps of linen, wool, or fur shielded bodies, but they never covered everyone equally. In the night, a tug of the blanket was a tug of war. If your cousin pulled too hard, your shoulder was exposed to the icy air. If your brother kicked in his sleep, straw shifted, and cold seeped up from the earth. Arguments broke out, grumbles exchanged, but no one dared keep the quilt for themselves. Selfishness meant frostbite, meant misery, meant maybe even death. Survival was a group effort, stitched, literally, into every square of cloth. And then there was the bedding itself. Straw flattened night after night, dampened with sweat, soured with spilled ale or milk, sometimes worse. Fleas lived there, biting whenever you shifted. Lice found their way into hair. Mice rustled in the corners, bold enough to scavenge crumbs dropped during supper. To us, it sounds unbearable. But to them, it was life. Fleas and filth were despised, yes, but tolerated, endured, woven into the rhythm of every night. A fresh layer of straw, if you were lucky enough to gather it before snow buried the fields, felt like a luxury. Some families tucked herbs, lavender, mint, sage into bedding to fight the smell, and for a moment the hut might carry the faint fragrance of summer, even while frost piled at the door. But soon enough, smoke and sweat reclaimed their dominance, and always hunger lingered. Winters stripped the land bare, leaving families with stores of grain, dried beans, salted fish if they were fortunate, or hunks of cheese hardened with age. Before bed, it was common to share scraps, crusts of bread, a swallow of ale warmed near the fire, maybe a thin broth if fuel allowed it. These were not feasts. They were tokens, reminders to the stomach that it wasn't entirely forgotten. Imagine chewing a piece of bread so hard it scrapes your gums, washing it down with bitter ale and finding comfort in it not because it tastes good, but because it settles the gnawing ache just enough to let you sleep. That was the nightly ritual. Small, meager, but binding. A family sharing scraps in silence, muttering thanks for another day endured. And with hunger came dreams. Medieval people saw dreams as more than illusions. They were messages, sometimes from God, sometimes from spirits, sometimes from the body itself. An empty stomach could twist visions into strange prophecies. Dreaming of bread meant harvest to come. Dreaming of meat meant strength ahead. Smoke shaped dreams too, turning shadows into spirits, fire into phantoms, wolves into demons scratching at the door. Priests warned villagers not to trust all dreams, calling some mere tricks of the body. But how could anyone dismiss them when they felt so real? In a hut where every sound, every smell, every shadow pressed against your senses, dreams blurred with waking life until the two became almost indistinguishable. And speaking of shadows, fear was constant. Wolves howled in the distance, their cries stretching through the wind. Raiders were whispered about, men desperate enough to steal food even in snowstorms. The flimsy wooden door was no true defense. So villagers turned to charms. Juniper sprigs tied above the beam, iron knives wedged into thresholds, salt sprinkled across doorframes. Were these protections? Maybe not. But belief was its own kind of warmth. To sleep under a quilt patched with scraps was one thing. To sleep under a quilt with a hidden charm sewn inside, a sliver of iron or a saint's medal, was something else. It meant you weren't just trusting wood and cloth. You were trusting tradition, faith, memory, all invisible walls against the dark. Silence, too, had meaning. In some villages, families kept strict hush after the fire was banked. Words wasted breath. Loud voices risked disturbing sleepers or drawing spirits, and so night became a fragile pact. Even children knew instinctively not to chatter. Their giggles could wait until dawn. What remained instead was a chorus of life snores, coughs, the grunt of animals, the creak of timbers, the hiss of wind. To us, noise is disturbance. To them, it was reassurance. Silence was worse. Silence meant the fire had died. The animals had frozen. The family had stopped breathing. Noise was proof of survival. And survival was always fragile. A cough could spiral into fever. Smoke could sting lungs until they rasped. Straw could collapse beneath the weight of bodies, letting frost creep in. Snow could press against the roof, threatening collapse. Darkness could stretch so long it bent the mind. But night after night, people endured. They endured because of quilts patched by mothers' hands, because of embers banked by father's care, because of prayers whispered by children half asleep. They endured because no one faced winter alone. So when dawn finally came and roosters crowed outside, believed to chase away demons with their cry, there was gratitude. People crossed themselves, whispered thanks not for comfort, but for survival. Another night had been won, another morning had arrived, and in a world where nothing was guaranteed, that small victory meant everything. Morning doesn't arrive in a blaze of sunshine, not in winter. Instead, it comes in shades of gray. The faintest light sneaks through the cracks in the roof and the gaps in the wooden walls. Not warm, not golden, but enough to say, you made it through. For peasants in medieval Europe, this was the rhythm. Each dawn wasn't a chance to rest. It was a call back into labor. But before we rush into the chores, let's linger for a moment. At the tail end of the night, the place where survival, exhaustion, and resilience all blend together. Because even after surviving the cold and the dark, families faced one more challenge space. Imagine a single-room wooden hut, no larger than a modern garage. Into it you'd fit not just parents and children, but often grandparents, cousins, maybe even neighbors when storms grew too fierce. Add a pig, a goat, and a few chickens, and suddenly you're living in a crowded ark, a patchwork of human and animal breath pressed together under one sagging roof. Privacy? Forget it. Personal space? It didn't exist. Sleep wasn't peaceful. It was survival stacked on top of survival. Children were pressed into the center, shielded by older bodies. Elders lay on the outside, catching drafts, but also defending the group from the creeping cold that entered through every crack. Limbs tangled, shoulders ached, and arguments sparked over blankets pulled too far in one direction. Yet, no one could afford to separate. To split apart was to lose heat, and heat meant life. That closeness shaped more than just warmth. It shaped relationships. Modern people think of family as parents and children. But in medieval winters, family often meant whoever was pressed against you when the frost came. Cousins, neighbors, the traveler with no other shelter. Community wasn't an idea. It was a physical reality, woven into every night of shared breath and mutual survival. Of course, this closeness carried burdens. Smells built up until the air grew thick smoke from the fire. Sweat soaked into quilts, animal musk, even the sting of urine where children couldn't always hold through the night. It wasn't rare for bedding to reek. And yet, when people wrote about their winters, they didn't focus on the stink. They focused on endurance. They knew filth was part of the bargain. The only question was whether you could live through it. And let's not forget the storms. If wolves were the fear beyond the door, snow was the fear above. Roofs sagged under the weight, beams creaked, and families lay awake listening to every groan as though waiting for collapse. One gust of wind could rattle the door so hard it seemed ready to splinter. Villagers told children to press their hands against the walls during storms, whispering that their touch helped the hut hold steady. Did it work? Not really. But belief is powerful. Sometimes belief was the only insulation they had. Scholars still debate whether snow was curse or blessing. On one hand, heavy drifts could collapse a roof or block a door, sealing families in. On the other hand, thick snow pressed against the walls worked like insulation, trapping heat inside like a crude igloo. The truth is, it was both. Families never knew if the white silence outside was saving them or threatening them. That uncertainty alone kept people awake, listening, waiting, whispering prayers. And prayers mattered. Religion wasn't a Sunday affair. It was a nightly lifeline. Mothers whispered to saints to protect the hearth. Fathers muttered pleas for strong woodpiles and healthy children. Children crossed themselves half asleep, mimicking the gestures they saw, believing that even the smallest sign could keep frost or illness away. Small relics, bits of cloth, crude wooden crosses, herbs tucked into rafters were scattered through huts, not as decoration, but as armor. In a world where the wind could kill and snow could bury, faith was a weapon as sharp as any blade. But faith wasn't only about saints. Folk belief tangled with religion until the two became inseparable. Ashes sprinkled across thresholds were said to confuse spirits. Knives wedged into doorframes kept witches away. Charms sewn into quilts blessed the sleepers within. Every night was stitched with layers of protection: cloth, wood, iron, words, breath. None of it guaranteed safety. All of it gave people strength to lie down and close their eyes anyway. And then there were the animals. They weren't just resources. They were survival partners. A pig's body heat added to the room. A goat's low bleat was reassurance that life still pulsed in the corner. Chickens, restless and muttering on their perch, were part of the night's soundtrack. Families even blessed them before sleep, crossing themselves toward the pig, the goat, the hens, believing animals deserved protection too, because if the animals died, hunger would follow. And hunger, more than wolves or witches, was the enemy that stalked every hut in winter. That hunger seeped into everything. Meals were thin bread so hard it had to be soaked in ale, broth made from bones boiled until they gave up the last of their strength, scraps of cheese more mold than milk. Sometimes, families stretched their food with whatever they could: acorns ground into meal, weeds pulled from beneath snow, or bark stripped from trees in desperate times. At night, a shared swallow of ale wasn't about pleasure. It was about nourishment, about calming nerves and dulling pain, enough to let the body slip into sleep. Even children drank it, not as indulgence, but as medicine against the cold. So how did people sleep in wooden huts during brutal medieval winters? They didn't sleep the way we think of it. They endured. They drifted in and out of rest, broken by cold, by chores, by whispers, by fear. Many followed a rhythm we now call segmented sleep, two halves of rest broken by a stretch of wakefulness in the middle. During that time, people prayed, tended fires, whispered stories, or simply sat in silence, listening to the dark press around them. It wasn't strange. It was expected. The body adapted to nights that stretched 14 hours long. Sleep became a cycle, a negotiation, not a luxury. And yet, within all that discomfort, something remarkable thrived: connection, intimacy, a bond born not from ease, but from shared hardship. In the huddled dark, families laughed quietly, traded stories, blessed one another, even argued over blankets in ways that reminded them they were alive. Life was loud, messy, smelly, uncomfortable, but it endured, and endurance itself became the miracle. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. If you've ever woken up in the middle of the night, stared at the ceiling, and thought, "What's wrong with me? Why can't I just sleep through?" you might be closer to the medieval world than you think. Because for them, Broken sleep wasn't a problem. It was the pattern. Historians call it segmented sleep. Peasants didn't drift off at sundown and wake neatly at dawn. Instead, night was divided. First, sleep, a period of deep rest after the evening chores. And second, sleep, another stretch before the rooster crowed. In between came a pocket of wakefulness, a strange, suspended time where life didn't stop but shifted. Imagine a hut in that midnight pause. The fire is low but alive, glowing faintly under its ash blanket. Children stir and murmur in half-dreams. A father rises quietly, poking at the coals, coaxing them back to life before they die completely. His movement makes the goat shift, stamping once, while a chicken lets out a sleepy flutter on its perch. The mother stirs too, not fully awake, but enough to whisper a prayer or check the baby. No one is alarmed. No one panics. This is simply the way the night works. Some villagers used that time for devotion. Monks weren't the only ones who believed midnight was sacred. Ordinary people, huddled in smoky huts, folded their hands and prayed. They asked saints for health, whispered thanks for another day alive, or begged for strength to face tomorrow's hunger. Others used the time more practically, mending clothes by firelight, tending to ailing animals, or even slipping quietly to a neighbor's hut for company. Court records from the Middle Ages even hint at something more intimate. Husbands and wives often used those midnight hours for closeness, a time of tenderness when children were asleep and the world felt suspended. Quiet conversations, soft laughter, the kind of intimacy that kept bonds alive when daylight was nothing but labor. In a strange way, this broken rhythm carved out a space for connection, a space we, in our 24-hour glow of electric light, rarely find anymore. And then there were the dreams. Oh, the dreams. Medieval people didn't shrug them off as random brain noise the way we do. Dreams were signs, omens, messages. Early night dreams were often dismissed as nonsense, the residue of supper or smoke. But dreams that came after waking the ones in second sleep were thought to carry weight. People believed those visions were truer, freer, born from a body lighter with rest, and a soul closer to wandering. So imagine this. A child wakes from first sleep, stomach hollow, and drifts into second slumber. In the dream, steaming loaves of bread appear, rich and endless. To us, that might sound like hunger working on the mind, but to that child's family, it might be read as a promise of a good harvest ahead. Dreams of meat meant strength. Dreams of water meant plenty. Not every dream was comforting. Fever dreams of wolves, fire, or endless snow could terrify whole households. A priest might warn that such visions revealed sin. A grandmother might insist they were only the body's way of crying out. But either way, they were taken seriously. Think about how different that is from today. We treat dreams like curiosities, maybe funny stories to share at breakfast. But for medieval peasants, dreams were woven into decision-making. Should they plant early? Should they avoid traveling? Should they make an offering at the church? Sometimes those choices leaned on what was seen in second sleep. In a world where so much was uncertain, even illusions offered direction. But let's step back into the hut itself. In those in-between hours, it isn't silent. Far from it. Every body makes a sound. Someone snores. Someone coughs. A child whimpers in a nightmare. The pig grunts in the corner. The straw rustles constantly. as bodies shift. To us, it might feel unbearable, a cacophony of interruptions. To them, it was background music, the chorus of survival. Noise didn't mean disturbance, noise meant life. And the fire, always the fire. Keeping it alive through the night was non-negotiable. A dying hearth wasn't just inconvenient, it was deadly. Relighting a fire in the middle of winter, without matches or lighters, meant fumbling with damp wood, sparks, and luck. Families guarded their coals like treasure. Sometimes they buried embers in dung mixed with straw, letting it smolder until morning. The smell was acrid, filling the hut with a sharper smoke, but survival made every odor tolerable. Some even spoke to the fire, thanking it, coaxing it, treating it like another family member. And, in many ways, it was. Now imagine being half awake, staring at the rafters blackened with soot, listening to the hut creak under snow. Darkness stretches too long. Hours pass slower than they do by day. Some families whispered psalms to count the time. Others simply lay awake, thoughts wandering, fears pressing. Was the food enough to last another week? Would illness take hold? Would the roof survive another storm? These weren't abstract worries. They were daily realities. And every night, the dark seemed to magnify them. Darkness itself was feared almost as much as cold. Without lamps or candles, luxuries few peasants could afford, the hut was swallowed in blackness once the fire dimmed. Shadows became spirits. Drafts felt like hands. A creak in the beams became a witch riding the wind. Parents warned children not to stare too long into the dark, lest spirits climb into their eyes. Superstition or not, lying awake in that endless night, it was easy to believe. But eventually, second sleep came. The body gave in, exhaustion winning over fear. Limbs relaxed, breathing steadied, and the crowded hut fell into uneasy quiet once more. That rhythm, first sleep, wakefulness, second sleep, wasn't strange. It was human adaptation to long, brutal winters. And though scholars argue whether everyone followed it, in huts like these, it seemed as natural as the seasons themselves. By dawn, when faint light finally crept into the hut, survival had been proven again. The roof still stood. The fire still lived. The family still breathed. And as they stirred from second sleep, no one celebrated comfort. They celebrated endurance. Because in the medieval winter, just making it through the night was victory enough. By now, you can see that a medieval winter wasn't something anyone faced alone. A single hut, no matter how carefully built, was too fragile a defense against the season's weight. That's why, in the harshest months, survival often meant sharing space, pressing families, neighbors, and even strangers into one smoky room until there was barely an inch of straw left uncovered. Picture it. Your family hut is already crowded with parents, children, and a few animals tucked inside for warmth. Then, one midnight, there's a knock, or maybe just the sound of a shovel scraping snow outside. Your uncle pushes through the door, cheeks raw from wind, carrying a bundle with a coughing child wrapped inside. Behind him comes an aunt, already shivering, whispering apologies. They've run out of wood, or maybe their roof gave under snow. Either way, your hut has just become theirs. Suddenly, the small space feels smaller. The air grows heavier, thick with more breath, more sweat, more smoke. A cousin elbows his way into the bedding pile, tugging at the quilt. Your aunt sets her child down near the fire, displacing your sister. Someone mutters, someone sighs, but no one says no. Because as cramped as it feels, everyone knows the rule. It is better to argue warm than freeze alone. Historical records back this up. Parish notes, village chronicles, even the occasional tax ledger mention families crowding together when the cold grew deadly. A hut built for 5 might hold 15 on a winter night. And yes, it caused problems. Who gets the best spot near the fire? Who tends the flames when they falter? Who snores too loud, coughs too often, hogs too much blanket? Quarrels sparked as quickly as embers. But still, people chose closeness. And here's something odd. Folklore suggests that these nights weren't only about necessity. They carried ritual. Before sleep, relatives might exchange blessings or charms, an herb sprig tucked under a pillow, a whispered saint's name breathed into the smoky air. Small acts of protection meant to smooth over tensions and remind everyone that the hut was more than wood and straw. It was a vessel of survival, held afloat not only by warmth, but by goodwill. Imagine lying there, pressed between your own siblings and your cousin's restless elbow. Every shift pulls the quilt, every turn rustles the straw. The air is stifling, thick with the smell of sweat, ale, animals, and smoke. Yet within that mess is reassurance. The draft at the door feels weaker, the roof creaks less sharply. Every extra body is another barrier against the frost outside. Historians still argue over whether such nights built stronger family bonds or frayed them. Did they teach patience and generosity, or did they leave scars of resentment? The truth, of course, is both. Children laughed quietly, trying to guess which relative was snoring loudest. Adults snapped at elbows and smells. But when wolves howled outside or snow piled high against the door, there was comfort in knowing you weren't alone. Even the animals felt it. The goat bleated softly at the newcomers. The pig grunted, displeased but soon settling into the straw. Hens rustled their feathers, adjusting on their perch. In folklore, families sometimes blessed their animals before bed, tracing the sign of the cross or whispering protective words. Because if the family survived the night, so must the creatures that fed them. And then came the small mercies that made the closeness bearable. A sip of ale passed around the circle, its warmth spreading through bellies like a second fire. A story whispered in the dark memories of summer harvests, of weddings, of festivals that seemed impossibly far away. The stories, like the drink, softened the edges of discomfort. Hope shared through words and voices kept the night from crushing spirits. By morning, the hut would reek of sweat, smoke, and overcrowding. Limbs would ache from being pinned beneath cousins. Arguments would simmer. But beneath it all was one undeniable truth. Survival had been achieved again, not by fire alone, but by sheer closeness. In medieval winters, warmth was never an individual possession. It was a communal burden, passed body to body, night after night. And in that fragile, noisy, smelly heap of humanity, endurance took root. If sharing space with half the village was one way to survive the night, sharing drink was another. Because in a medieval winter, water wasn't always the friend you might think it was. Wells froze, streams ran muddy with runoff, and even when water looked clean, it often carried sickness. So what did families reach for when their throats dried, when their bellies growled, or when the night felt too long, ale. Not the heavy, intoxicating kind we picture at a tavern, but a weak, steady brew, barely more alcoholic than modern kombucha. And yet, it carried weight in every sense. Safer than water, nourishing in small ways, and warm, especially when passed around a smoky hut where firewood was scarce. Imagine the scene. The hut is bursting with bodies, the air hot and stifling despite the cold outside. Someone, maybe your father, reaches for a small jug by the hearth. He pours a little into clay mugs, one for each adult, even a sip for the older children. The liquid is sour, earthy, tinged with the faint sweetness of malt. Not a feast, not luxury. But when it hits your stomach, it feels like a small ember glowing from within. You can almost hear the sighs ripple around the room. Shoulders loosen, breath slows. The baby, too young for the taste, calms at the softened voices around him. Ale was more than drink, it was ritual. A quiet exhale at the end of a brutal day. Records from the Middle Ages make this clear. Household accounts show ale brewed in constant cycles, as essential as bread. In fact, many peasants called it liquid bread. And yes, even children drank it. Not because parents were reckless, but because it was part of survival. Weak enough not to harm, strong enough to soothe. Historians debate its role in sleep. Some argue it dulled aches, softened fear, and pulled peasants into rest they might not otherwise have found. Others believe the effect was mostly ritual comforting, but not medicinal. But sitting in that hut, the warmth buzzing in your chest, the noise of the storm a little easier to ignore, it's hard not to side with the first explanation. And here's the thing, ale wasn't just drink, it was memory. Each mug carried stories. After a few sips, whispers began. Someone recalled a summer harvest, when fields were heavy with grain. Another spoke of a wedding feast, music and dancing long into the night. In a hut where winter pressed like a fist, ale opened small windows back to joy, back to hope. Can you see how important that was? Winter wasn't only a physical trial. It was mental. It gnawed at spirits, stretched nights into what felt like forever. But with ale in the cup and stories in the air, peasants carved out a kind of resistance. A reminder that life wasn't only smoke, hunger, and cold. It was laughter, memory, and the stubborn will to find warmth anywhere it could be made. By the time mugs were drained, the hut had quieted again. Bodies settled back into straw. Embers glowed faintly in the hearth. And the ale, weak though it was, had done its work. Hearts were lighter. Breath was slower. Fear had lost some of its grip. For nobles, wine and mead meant feasts and excess. But for peasants, ale was neither luxury nor vice. It was medicine against the night, a daily thread of survival woven into every hut. And in those long winters, sometimes that thread was all that kept families from unraveling. Once the mugs were emptied and the embers dimmed, another rhythm began to fill the hut. Not the clatter of stories or the soft giggles of children, but the murmur of prayer. In a world where frost, hunger, and illness stalked every night, faith was more than ritual. It was armor, invisible, but desperately needed. Picture a mother sitting upright in the smoky dark, her baby pressed to her chest, lips moving softly. The words aren't loud. They're not meant to be, but they carry weight. She whispers to Street, Bridget, the guardian of hearths, asking her to keep the fire alive. She pleads with Street Blaze, protector of throats, to spare her children from the cough that can turn deadly in a crowded hut. Sometimes it is Street Joseph, sometimes a local saint or a forgotten folk spirit. The names shift, but the act is the same. Prayer was a shield as real as any cloak. One fascinating detail recorded in parish accounts is how common it was to tuck tiny relics into the home itself. A scrap of cloth said to have touched a shrine, a crude wooden cross nailed above the door, even small charms sewn directly into quilts, so that protection literally wrapped the family as they slept. Some families slipped bits of iron or bone into the seams, half religious, half superstition, a hedge against both spirits and sickness. Skeptics today might ask, did it work? Did whispered words or hidden tokens truly make a difference? But in a hut with snow pressing against the roof and wolves howling beyond the door, the answer didn't matter. Belief itself warmed the heart, steadied the hand, and gave parents something to offer their children beyond food or fire. And faith was never separate from daily life. Peasants crossed themselves before tending the fire. They blessed the pig and the hens before bed, muttering short lines as though animals too needed protection from frost and spirits. Children mimicked these gestures half asleep, tracing clumsy crosses in the air, repeating words they barely understood. It was instinct, passed down like the quilt or the hearth's care, a ritual that made nights feel less dangerous. Historians still debate how much comfort this devotion truly provided. Was it deep, sincere faith? Or was it mostly habit, performed because not doing it felt risky? Perhaps both. But when you look into the ember light and see a father's lips moving quietly, asking simply for strength to split more wood, for health enough to keep his children alive until spring, you understand. Prayer was survival. It gave shape to fear. It turned despair into words, and words into hope. Folklore even preserves small customs tied to these nightly prayers. Ash sprinkled across the threshold to confuse wandering spirits. Salt at the door to ward off frost demons. Iron knives driven into door frames, not for fighting, but as talismans. It sounds strange to us now, but for them, it was all part of the same rope of survival, religion, and superstition braided together, a rope strong enough to cling to through the dark. And when the hut settled again into silence, it wasn't only smoke or quilts that held it together. It was the weight of those whispered words, rising like faint smoke into the rafters, carried upward as though the night itself might listen. The hush of prayer lingers in the rafters, but soon another sound swells over it, the deep groan of timber as the wind begins to batter the hut. At first it's only a whisper, a draft sneaking through the cracks in the walls. Then it becomes a howl, rattling the door on its frame, making the roof sigh under the weight of snow. For families huddled inside, storms like this were as terrifying as they were familiar. Medieval accounts describe huts creaking like ships on stormy seas, the thatch above threatening to tear away with every gust. Inside, no one moved. Every groan of wood was listened to with clenched jaws and held breath. Parents pressed their hands over children's ears, whispering calm words they didn't fully believe themselves. Snow was not only beauty, snow was weight, pressing silently against walls and roofs, turning homes into fragile cages. Too much, and the door would be sealed shut by morning. Too much, and beams would crack, burying a family alive. Some chronicles record whole hamlets swallowed under drifts, roofs collapsing in the night, only faint cries heard by neighbors come morning. Folk remedies grew out of this terror. Ash was scattered across thresholds to confuse spirits said to ride the wind. Iron nails were hammered into doorframes, not to hold wood, but to ward off demons believed to travel in storms. Some families even told children to press their palms flat against the walls during gales, convinced that their touch, however small, might keep the hut upright. Imagine tiny hands spread on rough boards, whispering, "Stay, don't fall," as if the house itself could hear. Historians argue endlessly over how sturdy these huts truly were. Some insist well-built timber, daub, and clay held up surprisingly well. Others point to constant repairs, roofs patched year after year, and the frequent mentions of collapse in parish records. The truth likely lay somewhere in between. Skill and luck determined whether a family survived the night. And yet, storms carried more than danger. They carried stories. When the wind shrieked across the village, peasants swore it was witches riding the night sky, spirits tearing through clouds, or saints battling demons overhead. Tales grew out of fear, and fear shaped imagination. Each howl outside became a voice, each creak in the rafters a warning. But just as quickly as panic rose, endurance settled in. The family pressed closer, quilts pulled tighter, animals stamping nervously in their corners. And as hours passed, the storm's rhythm became almost predictable: howl, groan, rattle, repeat. It was violent, yes, but it was also strangely steady. Hearts began to sink with it. Breathing slowed again, and exhaustion reclaimed its place. For peasants, this was survival in its purest form, not fighting the storm, but outlasting it. A fragile hut, patched quilts, shared warmth, whispered prayers, and the stubborn belief that dawn would always come. And somehow, against the odds, it usually did. When the storm finally eased, it wasn't relief that filled the hut, it was silence. A heavy, muffled quiet pressed against the walls, thicker than any sound. Snow had piled high outside, blanketing the world so completely that the hut felt buried. For a moment, no one moved. The air inside was warmer, yes, but it was the warmth of being trapped. Medieval chronicles speak of snow not only as beauty, but as a danger that crept without warning. Drifts could block doors, forcing families to dig their way out. Before dawn froze the opening shut. Roofs bowed under the weight, groaned like tired beasts. Every creak above made parents glance upward, wondering if the rafters would hold one night longer. Animals sensed it first. Goats shifted uneasily, stamping hooves against the straw. The pig grunted, restless in its corner. Even hens ruffled feathers and clucked softly, disturbed by pressures no human could yet feel. Villagers often took such signs seriously. Folk belief held that if beasts stirred during heavy snow, collapse was close. Desperate families sometimes carried animals outside, even into waist-deep drifts, just to lighten the burden, pressing down on their homes. Imagine that, stumbling into a midnight storm, pushing livestock into the dark, just to keep a roof from snapping above your children's heads. Inside, the crowding grew worse. Neighbors who had sought shelter during the storm still lay scattered across the pallet, their breaths clouding the air. Straw flattened under too many bodies, the floor beneath growing damp and hard. Limbs pressed against limbs, blankets pulled back and forth in a silent tug of war. Comfort was gone. Survival was all that mattered. Privacy had no meaning in huts like these. One medieval proverb claimed, "A house is a mouth that must be fed, and a bed is a body with many heads." Children were sandwiched in the middle, shielded from drafts by parents at the edges. Elders grumbled from the corners, their snores loud enough to echo. Teenagers often drew the short straw, pushed toward the coldest spots, and expected to endure with youth's resilience. Scholars still debate whether this closeness built stronger families or frayed them. Did it bind them together, teaching compromise and patience? Or did it fuel quarrels, elbows and knees breeding resentment in the night? Perhaps it was both. For every whispered lullaby that soothed, there was also a grumble of irritation when someone stole the quilt. And yet, there was power in numbers. Parish records hint that villages believed warmth itself could be shared like a blessing, passed from one body to another. Families prayed together before sleep, crossing themselves not just for their own safety, but for every life crammed beneath that patched quilt. In the end, endurance came not from comfort, but from cooperation. As the storm's echoes faded into the snowy hush, the hut grew restless again. Too many bodies, too little space. Sweat mingled with smoke, with ale on breath, with the musky scent of animals. The air was thick enough to choke. But in that stifling closeness, there was reassurance too, proof that no one faced the night alone. This was medieval winter survival in its rawest form, not glorious, not comfortable, but unyielding. A night endured, shoulder to shoulder, heart to heart, with every breath, every stitch of quilt, every ember of fire, shared until dawn. Through all the noise of breath, the itch of straw, and the press of bodies, one sound mattered most: the faint crackle of fire. In a wooden hut during a medieval winter, the hearth wasn't just warmth, it was life itself. Without it, no quilt, no pile of straw, no crowd of neighbors could keep the frost from gnawing into bone. Medieval people treated fire almost like a living creature. It had to be fed, watched, and coaxed. Too much fuel, and it wasted precious wood. Too little, and embers died, leaving the family scrambling at dawn for a spark in the coldest air. Many chroniclers wrote that villagers never allowed their hearths to go fully dark in winter. Relighting fire from scratch was difficult, sometimes impossible without flint or tinder in good condition. So families banked their coals beneath ash, smothering them enough to sleep, but leaving a faint pulse glowing until morning. You can picture the ritual. A father, kneeling at the hearth, shoulders stooped, using an iron poker or even just a stick to nudge coals into place. Ash poured gently over them, forming a blanket gray and soft. The fire dimmed, but beneath it all, a line of red still pulsed like the hut's hidden heartbeat. Later in the night, he would rise again, add a twig or two, whisper a prayer, and crawl back under the quilt. The rhythm was constant. Survival required it. Some folk practices added curious twists. In certain villages, families mixed dried dung with straw and pressed it over embers. The smell was sharp, acrid, but the mixture insulated heat better than ash alone. Others scattered salt across the hearth, believing it warded off spirits that might steal the flame. Still others spoke to the fire directly, as though it could hear. A grandmother patting the hearthstone and murmuring, Stay with us. Superstition? Maybe. But in the heart of winter, faith and fire were never far apart. The smoke itself was a paradox. It stung eyes, blackened rafters, and aggravated coughs. Yet it also preserved food, fumigated huts, and, in some ways, kept worse illnesses at bay. Historians argue even now, did the smoke weaken families, or did it shield them? The truth is, both were probably true. Every breath was both burden and salvation. Children often fell asleep staring at the glow. For them, the red light was reassurance, proof that morning would come. Mothers whispered lullabies beside the hearth, their voices weaving with the hiss of embers. Some songs even carried warnings. Stay under covers, or frost will claim you. The fire, the song, the quilt, they were all part of one ritual, repeated every night of winter. What strikes modern readers most is not the hardship, but the patience. Families had no guarantee that fire would last, yet they trusted the rhythm bank coals. Sleep, rise, tend, sleep again. It was survival written in sparks and ash. And always there was the fear. If the fire went out, the hut became a tomb. Frost crept in fast, stiffening limbs before morning could save them. That is why embers mattered more than any meal, more than any dream. The hearth was the difference between enduring the night and being claimed by it. The embers glowed faintly, but the darkness pressed heavier still. Winter nights in the Middle Ages were long, far longer than we are used to now. In Northern Europe, darkness could stretch 14 hours or more. Imagine a hut of rough timber and thatch. No lamp oil, no candles except on rare feast days. For most peasants, the night wasn't just dark, it was suffocating. Chroniclers described how peasants often measured time not by clocks, but by survival. The endless night weighed on the mind as much as the body. Some whispered prayers to pass the hours. Others counted breaths or murmured psalms, letting the rhythm calm the anxiety of waiting for dawn. Without distraction, silence became loud. A cough from one corner sounded like thunder. The shuffle of a goat's hooves seemed like warning drums. Even your own heartbeat thudded like a hammer in your ears. And with silence came imagination. The wind rattling the door wasn't just weather. It might be wolves, or worse, spirits. Medieval folklore is filled with figures said to wander the winter dark. The frost hag, who touched children with icy fingers, spirits that slipped through rafters if prayers weren't said, or witches said to ride the storm winds. Were these stories pure invention? Or were they born from nights lying awake in huts, listening to wood groan under snow and wind? Darkness shaped faith, too. Priests used night as metaphor, shadow as sin, dawn as salvation. Families prayed to saints for protection, street Blaze for throats, street Bridget for the hearth, street Joseph for shelter. Religion and superstition blended in these hours. A wooden cross tucked into rafters, salt sprinkled at the threshold, a whispered charm over embers. It was all part of the same battle against the night. And then there were dreams. Modern people think of dreams as random, but medieval families believed them meaningful. Hunger dreams of bread were seen as prophecies of good harvests. Nightmares of wolves or snowdrifts were warnings from God, or signs of demons lurking. Even fever dreams from smoke-filled lungs or sickness were interpreted as messages. People woke trembling, unsure if what they had seen was only imagination or a glimpse of truth. The psychological weight of darkness was immense. but just as often it brought intimacy. In the silence, families whispered quietly, parents telling stories, children asking questions too shy to voice in daylight. Neighbors packed into huts during storms, sometimes shared blessings or traded charms. Even fear could draw people closer, as bodies pressed tighter under the same quilt, as hearts beat together through the long wait. One curious practice, written in parish records, told children not to stare too long into the dark. Villagers feared the night could climb into your eyes if you gave it too much attention. Whether true or not, the advice captures the mood of the time. Darkness wasn't absence, it was presence. Something alive, pressing on every wall, every mind. Yet always, dawn came. That thin silver line leaking through cracks in the roof was more than light. It was victory. Another night endured. Another chance to try again. The first hint of dawn was not golden light streaming across the sky, but a faint gray seeping through cracks in the roof. Medieval mornings didn't begin with comfort. They began with relief. Families whispered quick thanks, not to celebrate rest, but to acknowledge survival. Parish notes describe peasants crossing themselves at first light, murmuring, "Thank you for another day." It wasn't ceremony, it was instinct. But dawn also meant work. Before the hut had even shaken off its smoky breath, people were already moving. The father rose first, stiff from straw, reaching for boots stiff with frost. His first task was the hearth stirring embers, buried under ash, coaxing them back into flame. Without that fragile fire, the hut's warmth would vanish, and all the night's endurance would have been for nothing. The mother shifted next, brushing straw from her hair, already reaching for the pot. Morning began with feeding, not feasting. Thin porridge from barley or oats, stale bread softened with broth or ale, sometimes onions or dried beans if the family had them. Food wasn't about flavor. It was about energy enough to face the cold again. Children gnawed on crusts with sleepy faces, learning early that hunger was as constant as breath. Then came the animals. Goats bleated, hens rustled, pigs rooted noisily, every creature demanding care before the people themselves could rest. Feeding animals wasn't kindness. It was survival strategy. A goat's milk, a pig's fat, a hen's eggs were lifelines. Parish accounts note how peasants sometimes gave their last scraps of grain to livestock, trusting the animals would return the favor in the days ahead. Outside, the snow waited. Doors had to be shoved open against drifts, paths beaten down with boots. Water wasn't fetched, it was hacked. Ice broken from frozen streams, or melted from snow over the fire. Even children carried buckets, their fingers red and raw. And yet, for all its hardship, dawn carried a strange hope. The hut still stood. The roof hadn't collapsed. Wolves hadn't broken in. Sickness hadn't stolen another life in the night. The morning chorus, rooster crowing, animals stirring, human voices muttering, was proof that life endured. One curious folk custom recorded in village lore described families greeting the rooster's crow as more than a timekeeper. It was said the rooster's cry banished evil spirits, driving away whatever haunted the night. Perhaps it was superstition, or perhaps it was simply comfort, knowing that a single sound could mark the end of fear. The day ahead was no kinder than the night behind. Work would fill every hour, chopping wood, patching roofs, tending to frozen fields, mending tools. But still, Mourning meant victory. Not comfort, not abundance, just survival. And for medieval peasants, survival was enough. If nights in the hut were a test of endurance, mornings were the beginning of strategy. The pale daylight exposed everything: leaky roofs, thinning firewood stacks, half-empty grain sacks, even the frost creeping like veins along the inside of the walls. Survival didn't end with waking. It only changed shape. The first task after tending animals was wood. Always wood. Firewood wasn't just heat, it was life insurance. Medieval records often describe disputes over forests, because without fuel, huts became iceboxes. Children and elders gathered sticks and brush near the village, while men dragged heavier logs when strength allowed. Some households used peat or dried dung, both smoky and foul, but better than nothing. Imagine the hut already heavy with stale breath and smoke. Then add the sharp sting of burning dung. This was the air peasants breathed daily. Water came next. Streams were often frozen solid, forcing villagers to hack through layers of ice with axes. Buckets of snow were hauled inside, to melt by the fire, each drop carefully rationed. Chronicles describe how entire families might share a single bucket for cooking, washing, and drinking, stretching every drop through the day. It wasn't clean by modern standards, but in an age before germ theory, water was judged less by purity and more by availability. Food, of course, was never far from anyone's mind. In winter, meals were predictable: coarse bread, porridge, maybe a salted herring if fortune allowed. Occasionally, dried beans or cabbage, stored in pits beneath the frozen ground, offered variety. Villagers dreamed of summer markets with fresh produce and fragrant herbs, but winter forced monotony. Some families brewed thin soups from bones, scraping every last bit of fat into the pot. There was a saying in certain parishes: "A bone boiled thrice feeds 3 times." Work was constant, even in cold that cracked the skin and numbed the fingers. Roofs had to be patched with whatever could be found: bundles of reeds, moss, or strips of hide. Walls sealed with mud and straw needed constant repair, and tools dulled by frost demanded sharpening. For without them, even the simplest chores became impossible. Every hour of labor was another stitch in the fragile fabric of survival. And yet, not all daylight was toil. Families found ways to soften the grind. Women mended clothing by the firelight, turning rags into tunics, sewing scraps into mittens. Children carved toys from wood or braided straw into makeshift dolls. Neighbors sometimes gathered, sharing news, stories, or songs, their voices a reminder that life was more than hunger and cold. Parish accounts even mention that in the harshest months, families sometimes told jokes in the evenings, not to deny hardship, but to mock it, laughing at winter so it would not crush their spirits. But always, there was preparation for night. As the sun dipped again so early in winter, so quickly the cycle began anew. Fires were banked, animals secured, straw rearranged, blankets stretched. Sleep would not be comfort, it would be survival. And that is the rhythm of life in a medieval hut. Dawn as fragile relief, day as ceaseless labor, night as another trial. Each sunrise was victory, each sunset another test. And through it all, people endured patching huts, sharing warmth, and learning to live with less than we can imagine today. In a medieval hut, no one was exempt from the struggle. Every body, no matter how small or frail, had a role to play. Children were not tucked away from hardship, they were woven directly into it. At dawn, they stirred from the straw, rubbing sleep from smoke-stung eyes, and joined their parents in the routines of survival. Little ones fetched kindling, their small arms carrying twigs bundled against their chests. They gathered rushes or moss from the hut's edges, anything dry enough to feed the fire. Some carried buckets of snow or water, staggering under the weight. It wasn't busy work, it was vital. Every stick, every drop, every handful counted. In records from rural England and France, priests often wrote of children collapsing from exhaustion during winters, but just as often, they praised their resilience. These were children raised not with toys of luxury, but with tools of necessity. Elders, too, bore responsibility. They were the keepers of memory. Their bodies might be bent and slow, but their voices carried the weight of past winters survived. Grandparents told stories not only to soothe children, but to instruct them. Tales of wolves became warnings about vigilance. Legends of saints were lessons in courage. Even proverbs woven into songs like, "Snow is a blanket, but it smothers as it warms," were practical wisdom disguised as rhyme. Inside the hut, old hands mended tools, too fragile for rough work. They wove baskets, repaired nets, or sorted seed for spring. These tasks, quiet but steady, were as important as chopping wood or hauling water. Without them, families entered spring unprepared. Some elders carved charms or blessed herbs, passing on rituals that blurred the line between superstition and survival. For children, play itself mirrored life. Games were not about wooden knights and castles. They were about hauling, building, pretending to cook or herd. A daughter might rock a doll made of straw in imitation of her mother rocking a real child. A son might scrape the earth with a stick, copying the way his father dug. Play was training, and training was survival. But there was warmth in these bonds too. On especially bitter nights, children were pressed into the middle of the bedding heap, shielded by older siblings and parents. Their tiny breaths added to the chorus of survival, their presence a reason for adults to keep tending fires, keep patching leaks, keep pushing through. Elders slept closer to the edges, absorbing drafts, their bodies a final wall between frost and the young. This arrangement was not random, it was the architecture of survival, written in flesh and breath. Chroniclers described the hut as a place where age and youth met in cycles. Elders told of winters past, children carried those lessons forward, and parents bore the heaviest burden in between. And so the generations bound themselves together, not just in blood, but in the rhythm of endurance. Life in a medieval hut was never about one person's strength. It was about the collective, the smallest child with her armful of twigs, the grandmother stitching patches by firelight, the father coughing but still feeding embers, the mother dividing bread crusts into equal shares. Together, they made it through nights that no single body could endure alone. If humans filled the hut with their breath, their warmth, their restless sounds, the animals completed the picture. Survival in winter wasn't only about family, it was about every living thing sheltered within those fragile wooden walls. Goats, pigs, chickens, sometimes even a calf, lamb, all pressed into the smoky dark with their human keepers. Why bring livestock into the hut? The answer was simple. Because cold didn't spare them. A dead goat meant no milk come spring. A frozen hen meant no eggs when the thaw arrived. A lost pig was not just meat gone, it was wealth gone. security gone. Families knew their animals were lifelines, and so the creatures slept beside them, woven into the same quilt of survival. The arrangement was far from neat. Chickens fluttered against rafters, sometimes scattering droppings onto bedding below. Goats tugged at their tethers, bleeding if smoke grew too thick. Pigs grunted, rolled, and occasionally squealed in the night, startling children awake. And yet, their presence was reassuring. Each grunt, each flutter, each bleat was proof that life still pulsed within the hut. Archaeologists studying floor layers of medieval cottages often uncover thick deposits of dung, straw, and soot pressed into the earth, mute evidence of this shared existence. Written accounts describe the smell as overwhelming. Smoke, sweat, animal musk, and manure, all mingled together. To modern sensibilities, it might sound unbearable, but for peasants, this was normal. In fact, many believed the heat rising from the animals' bodies helped ward off frost. A pig, especially, was as much a furnace as it was livestock. Some folk proverbs even called the pig the poor man's blanket. There were practical hazards, of course. Fleas and lice jumped freely between people and beasts. Food scraps vanished into hungry mouths, sometimes before human hands could claim them. And when sickness struck, when animals coughed, limped, or grew weak, the entire hut lived with that fear. A sick goat was not just an animal in pain. It was the possibility of hunger stalking the family come spring. But the bond ran deeper than necessity. In folk tales whispered around embers, animals were protectors too. Stories told of pigs that squealed when wolves prowled near, of roosters whose crow banished evil spirits at dawn, of dogs who died to defend children from raiders. Whether entirely true or not, these tales shaped the way families saw the creatures around them, not just as food or property, but as allies in the battle against winter. At night, when the fire's glow dimmed and cold pressed through the cracks, the noises of animals mixed with the breathing of humans until there was no clear divide. The hut became one living organism, every heart, hoof, and hand beating in rhythm. It was messy, uncomfortable, and pungent, but it was also life. Scholars debate how much affection medieval peasants truly felt toward their livestock. Some argue animals were purely utilitarian, valued only for what they produced. Others see hints of tenderness in the way charms were tied to goats' horns or in lullabies sung while milking. Perhaps both are true. After all, when survival depends on a creature sleeping beside you, it becomes impossible not to see it as part of the family. And so, as snow fell and wind howled, medieval huts endured not as human shelters alone, but as shared sanctuaries, barn and bedroom fused into one. Each body, animal, and human alike, gave its warmth to the others. Each night, survival was a chorus of grunts, snores, bleats, and sighs. Crude, chaotic, but unbroken. If the animals inside the hut brought warmth, the dangers outside brought dread. Every winter night carried a shadow of fear. Wolves circling in the snow, bandits desperate enough to raid, or unseen spirits blamed for sickness and sudden death. Survival wasn't only a physical struggle against cold and hunger. It was also a battle of the mind. Wolves, in particular, haunted the imagination. When the forests were stripped of prey by deep snow, the animals came closer to villages. Travelers' chronicles describe footprints leading right up to cottage doors. and legends told of children snatched from paths at dusk. Whether these tales were exaggerated or not, the fear they created was real enough to shape behavior. Families banked their fires higher, whispered prayers to saints, and tied charms above doorways, sprigs of juniper, bits of iron, or simple wooden crosses to ward off predators they couldn't see. Bandits were another threat, though less predictable. Hunger could turn men as dangerous as wolves. Records from parish courts mention barns broken into, food stolen, and occasionally entire villages burned when rival groups clashed over dwindling supplies. In the hut, every gust of wind rattling the door might have been just the storm or a hand testing the latch. Fathers kept staffs or axes nearby, crude weapons against anything that breached the walls. And then there were the spirits, the frost hags, the night demons, the whispering presences people swore prowled during the longest, coldest hours. Modern scholars debate whether peasants truly believed in these figures, or if they were metaphors for danger and despair. But inside the smoky hut, with beams groaning under snow and shadows curling in the corners, belief was less important than fear itself. When you live so close to death, you name it, you give it shape, you tell stories about it. That way, at least, it feels like something you can resist. Children grew up on these tales. Some were warnings disguised as bedtime stories, stay under the blanket or the frost hag will find you. Others were lessons in courage, saints who fought wolves, villagers who fooled demons, farmers who prayed the snow into mercy. In the middle of a long night, these stories were more than entertainment. They were tools of survival, ways of turning fear into something bearable. And so sleep was never fully peaceful. Families huddled together not just for warmth but for reassurance. A sudden howl outside made everyone stir. A cough or a creak in the beams made hearts race. Yet each time, prayers, charms, and closeness soothed the fear enough to let exhaustion win. Night after night, danger pressed at the walls, and night after night, people endured. The medieval hut was never only wood and straw, it was a fragile fortress, a place where every ember, every whispered word, every animal grunt and child sigh worked together to push back against the dark. Illness was as much a part of medieval winters as the snow outside. A single cough in the smoky dark could ripple fear through an entire hut, because everyone knew how easily sickness spread in a space where 10 or more bodies breathed the same stale air. When one throat grew raw, it was only a matter of time before others followed. Smoke from the fire, though vital for warmth, also choked lungs. Medieval medical texts describe winter coughs that lasted for months, what we would now call chronic bronchitis. Children wheezed, elders hacked through the night, and each fit of coughing seemed to shake the fragile peace of sleep. The air carried more than warmth, it carried contagion. Families turned to remedies born of desperation and tradition. Garlic and onions were tied around necks or placed beneath pillows, their sharp scent believed to draw sickness out of the body. Sometimes vinegar-soaked cloths were pressed to foreheads, or hot stones wrapped in rags were tucked near the sick to ease chills. Whether or not these methods truly healed, they gave comfort. In a world without doctors for peasants, belief itself was medicine, but the danger was real. Records from monastic infirmaries mention winter waves of fevers, consumption, and what we might now call influenza. Few huts had the space to isolate the ill. The sick remained in the bedding heap with everyone else, their sweat soaking into the straw, their breath mingling in the smoky air. Children pressed close to parents for warmth, not knowing they were pressing closer to infection as well. And yet, there was no other choice. To separate the sick was to let them freeze. Survival meant togetherness, even when it carried risks. Families whispered prayers over the coughing, lit small charms near the spade hearth, and waited, hoping strength would return before fever claimed another. Illness was more than physical weakness, it was a thief of sleep. The rasp of a father's breath, the restless tossing of a fevered child, the anxious murmurs of a mother in prayer, all wove into the restless night chorus. Some chroniclers wrote that sleep itself was seen as medicine, a chance for the body to rebalance its humors. But true rest was scarce. Even when eyes closed, dreams were uneasy, twisted by hunger, smoke, and fear of what morning might reveal. And still, families endured. The hut, however fragile, became a place where love and fear intertwined. The quilt that smelled of sweat and herbs, the fire carefully coaxed alive, the whispered prayers at midnight, these were their defenses. Against cold, against wolves, against sickness itself. Because in winter, survival was never just about firewood and food. It was about holding on to each other, even when every breath carried risk. When sleep finally came in those crowded huts, it was rarely peaceful. Dreams twisted with the sounds, smells, and sensations of the night. Imagine lying on straw that scratched your skin, breathing smoke that stung your eyes, while hunger gnawed at your belly. How could the mind drift into calm? Instead, it slipped into visions. Medieval people didn't treat dreams the way we do today. To them, dreams were never random. They were messages, signs, sometimes even warnings. Monks and physicians wrote that dreams reflected the balance or imbalance of the body's humors. A dream of fire might mean fever. A dream of water might mean phlegm. Peasants, less interested in theory, believed dreams foretold real events. If someone dreamed of bread, it promised a good harvest. If someone dreamed of wolves, neighbors whispered it meant danger was close. Hunger, especially, was known to shape visions. Chroniclers describe starving villagers dreaming of endless feasts, only to wake with their mouths watering and their stomachs aching worse than before. Smoke, too, carved itself into the imagination. It wasn't unusual to dream of shadows rising in the rafters, or spirits drifting in from the dark, because that was what the body truly sensed even in slumber. Children's dreams were restless and loud. They murmured about strange figures, animals with glowing eyes, saints walking through snow, or demons scratching at the door. Parents, exhausted, sometimes listened closely, treating those ramblings as omens. Adults dreamed more heavily, visions filled with survival, warmth, food, and the hope of another day. One curious note from medieval sermons warns villagers not to trust all dreams. Priests claimed that sinful thoughts or evil spirits could slip into the mind at night, disguising themselves as visions, and yet, at the same time, dreams were often shared in the morning, weighed carefully, as though they might reveal what the coming season held. In the hut, dreams were never private. Every twitch, murmur, and cry was heard by everyone else. A child sobbing in sleep, a man groaning with fever, a woman whispering a prayer in her dream. All of it became part of the night's soundtrack. Dreams, like survival, were communal, and through them, imagination bled into reality. Wolves howling outside were woven into visions of beasts breaking down the door. The creak of the roof became spirits walking overhead. The hiss of wind through the cracks was heard as voices whispering in the dark. In that fragile state between sleep and waking, the line between what was real and what was dreamed blurred until no one could be certain. To live through a medieval winter night was not just to fight the cold, it was to live in a world where every dream carried weight, and every nightmare reminded you how thin the walls between life and death truly were. Superstition was as much a part of medieval nights as fire and straw. When you live in a world where wolves circle the village, sickness spreads from a single cough, and roofs groan under the weight of snow, it's no surprise that people turn to invisible protections. Faith and fear braided together, shaping the way families slept. Every hut had its little rituals. Some scattered herbs, sage, lavender, or juniper around the bedding to ward off pests and spirits alike. Others tucked sprigs above door frames or in the rafters, believing they kept evil from slipping in with the draft. Salt, expensive as it was, might be sprinkled at the threshold, a barrier against frost demons said to wander the night. Prayers blended seamlessly with charms. A mother might whisper a blessing over the baby before laying him down, tracing a small cross in the smoky air. A father might mutter words to the fire, asking it to stay alive until morning. To outsiders, it might look like superstition, but to the families who practiced it, these were acts of control in a world that often gave them none. Even animals were included. Before sleep, peasants sometimes blessed their pigs, goats, or hens, asking saints to protect them from sickness and frost. Livestock wasn't just wealth, it was survival. To lose a pig in winter could mean starvation. So prayers stretched beyond humans, weaving the entire hut into a circle of protection. Historians still debate how much people truly believed in these charms versus how much they followed them out of habit. But does it matter? In a fragile hut rattled by wind, belief itself was warmth. The act of speaking, of crossing yourself, of tucking a sprig of herb under the quilt, it eased fear. It gave people the courage to close their eyes. Folklore tells us of the frost hag, a crooked figure said to creep through villages on the coldest nights, touching sleepers with icy fingers. If the fire burned too low, her touch could steal breath away. To ward her off, families left scissors by the bed, iron charms on the wall, or even knives stuck into the hearthstone. It sounds strange to us, but in their world, where death came silently and without warning, these rituals mattered. Inside those huts, night was never just physical. It was spiritual, psychological, and symbolic. Silence itself carried weight, because villagers believed that speaking too much after the fire was banked might call attention from spirits wandering in the dark. So hush was enforced, not just for rest, but for safety. Faith, superstition, prayer, and fear were stitched into the same blanket. Together, they formed an invisible quilt, a shield no less real than the patched cloth covering families through the night. And under that shield, people slept not peacefully, not fully, but enough to endure until dawn. When dawn finally pressed its way through the cracks of the hut, it wasn't a flood of golden light like in paintings. It was a thin gray glow, seeping through gaps in the thatch and the uneven planks. Yet that faint shimmer was enough. After hours of darkness that felt endless, even a thread of light was a victory. But waking in a medieval winter was never gentle. Cold, rushed in the moment, blankets shifted. Limbs stiff from cramped sleep groaned as people stretched out of their tangled heap. A child cried, hungry before even opening his eyes. Someone coughed hard, shaking dust from the straw. There was no time to linger. Dawn was not an invitation to rest. It was a demand to rise. Medieval records remind us that peasants often rose before sunrise. Why? Because work could not wait. Fires needed stoking before frost claimed the coals. Water had to be broken free from ice before it could be fetched. Animals had to be fed before they weakened in the bitter cold. Every task was urgent, and every hour mattered. One curious folk custom said that the first words spoken at dawn shaped the tone of the day. Families whispered blessings like, "Thanks for another night survived," or "May this day keep us warm." It wasn't ceremony, it was instinct. Gratitude for waking alive, for roofs that had not collapsed, for wolves that had stayed in the woods. Survival itself was reason enough to give thanks. Still, dawn wasn't comfort. The cold hit hardest in those first hours, when embers had burned low, and bodies left the quilt's fragile cocoon. People dressed quickly, pulling on stiff wool or leather still damp from the day before. Breath fogged in the air as cloaks were tied tight, and boots tugged on with numbed fingers. Mothers stirred pots of thin porridge or broth, anything warm to wake stomachs and spirits alike. Yet there was hope in the morning. Dawn meant the night had not won. It meant another day rested from the grip of winter. Even if hunger gnawed and tasks piled high, the simple fact that light had returned gave people a burst of strength. Imagine hearing the rooster's crow breaking through the hush, a sound villagers believed pushed back evil spirits and marked the world safe again, at least until nightfall. The hut, still smoky and cramped, came alive with movement. Children shook straw from their hair. Fathers reached for tools. Mothers whispered quick prayers while spooning out whatever food remained. The same cycle that drained them was also what kept them alive. Nights of fear and endurance, followed by mornings of labor and gratitude. And so the rhythm continued. Each day demanded the same sacrifices, but each dawn carried the same truth. Winter could batter and break, but it could not fully claim those who endured together. Morning in a medieval hut wasn't just about waking, it was about immediately confronting survival. The first task was always the fire. Without it, no warmth, no food, no light for the day ahead. Fathers or older sons crouched by the hearth, poking at the faint red veins of embers, coaxing them back to life with twigs, dried moss, or if luck allowed, a scrap of kindling saved from yesterday. Sometimes the embers failed, and relighting meant sparks from flint and steel, a task that could steal precious minutes and strain patience already worn thin. While the fire stirred, mothers busied themselves with food. In winter, meals were rarely feasts. Breakfast often meant a thin broth from bones boiled days before, or a coarse porridge of oats and barley stretched with water. If ale remained, a mug might be passed around, warming bellies more reliably than cold water. Medieval accounts remind us that for peasants, ale was breakfast, lunch, and supper. Low in alcohol but steady with calories. Children had their own duties even before eating. Fetching water, for instance, was daily work. But in winter, streams froze and wells iced over. That meant breaking through layers of ice with heavy sticks, hauling cold water with bare hands, and carrying it back in wooden pails that chilled fingers until they went numb. Imagine a child, no older than 10, walking barefoot on snow-crusted paths because boots were too precious to wear out on chores. It wasn't cruelty, it was necessity. Animals, too, required tending before families ate. Goats and pigs grunted restlessly in their corners, hungry after the long night. Chickens needed feed and straw scattered, lest they grow too weak to lay eggs. In some villages, children were told, "Feed the beasts before yourselves," because the animals were the family's lifeline. Milk, eggs, meat, those were survival, and they came first. And all of this unfolded in air still bitterly cold, where each breath stung the lungs. Smoke hung low inside the hut, clinging to clothes and hair. Light seeped only faintly through cracks in the roof, reminding everyone how long it would be before the sun rose fully. Yet in these tasks, there was a rhythm. People didn't wait for comfort, they worked into it. Hands warmed over flames only after buckets were hauled. Bellies filled only after livestock settled. Historians often ask, how did families endure this endless grind without breaking? The answer lies in the small victories. A fire catching quickly. A pot bubbling with something hot, no matter how thin. A child laughing at a rooster's clumsy crow. These scraps of joy stitched mornings together just as surely as the quilt had bound bodies through the night. It was hard, yes, but in the shared labor of dawn, the hut began to feel less like a prison of cold and more like a vessel of survival. Everyone had a part, everyone had a purpose, and in that unity was strength. Once the fire was steady and the morning chores done, the real work of the day began. Winter didn't mean rest for medieval peasants. If anything, the season brought its own grueling list of tasks. Fields might be blanketed in snow, but there was still wood to chop, tools to mend, nets to repair, and animals to tend. Survival didn't come from waiting, it came from constant effort. No matter how raw the wind or how heavy the frost. Men often left the huts early, trudging through icy paths to the forest. Woodcutting was back-breaking work, but essential. A single day's firewood burned quickly in a drafty hut, so stacks had to be kept high, even if it meant hauling logs through drifts up to the knees. Imagine the sound of axes ringing against frozen trunks, echoing through a white forest where even birds had gone silent. Every swing was more than labor, it was insurance against the cold swallowing the family whole. Women, meanwhile, turned the smoky huts into workshops. Clothing didn't mend itself, and in a world where every scrap of wool and linen counted, patching was survival. Mothers sat near the fire, darning holes in stockings, sewing patches onto tunics, and tightening seams that had loosened under daily strain. If they were lucky, they spun yarn from wool stored before winter, their fingers working the spindle even in the biting air. Those fibers weren't just cloth, they were warmth, dignity, and proof that hands could still make something in a season that took more than it gave. Children had no escape from work either. Too young to swing an axe or mend clothes, they carried, fetched, and watched animals. Goats had to be led to the edge of the village, where scrub and bark could still be chewed. Hens had to be coaxed into laying with handfuls of grain. Even small chores mattered. Every egg, every stick of wood, every pail of water added up to survival. Meals were simple, sometimes pitiful. A thick bread made from barley or rye, coarse and dark. A stew stretched with roots, cabbage, or whatever scraps of dried meat could be spared. Some days, only thin gruel-filled bowls. Families ate together. Bowls passed hand to hand, each spoonful measured carefully. Hunger never really left it, just eased slightly after each meal. Yet even in the hardest winters, there was more than labor and hunger. Villagers found moments of life between the chores. Neighbors gathered to share stories, to swap small goods, or to sing against the silence of the snow. Children played with straw dolls, or carved bits of wood into toys. A fiddler might pull a tune in the corner of a hut, the sound thin, but enough to make feet tap on hard floors. As the day wore on, fatigue settled deep. Muscles ached from hauling wood. Fingers stung from cold water. Stomachs tightened with hunger. And it was this exhaustion, more than anything, that shaped how people slept. When the night came again, and families crowded beneath their patched quilts, rest was less about comfort and more about collapse. Sleep wasn't a luxury, it was the only way to keep the body ready for tomorrow's grind. In this rhythm of endless work and brief, fragile sleep, medieval huts became more than shelters. They were engines of survival, each chore and each breath fueling one more day against the weight of winter. As daylight faded, the rhythm of the hut shifted again. The chores were done, the tools stacked away, and animals bedded down for the night. Darkness came early in winter, long before bodies were ready to surrender. And so evenings became their own small world inside those wooden walls. Families gathered close around the hearth, the faint glow of embers painting faces in flickers of red. Supper was eaten slowly, not only to make it last, but because there was little else to fill the hours. A bowl of pottage passed from hand to hand, bread torn into smaller and smaller pieces, so that no one felt empty-handed. In wealthier homes, candles burned, but for peasants, firelight was enough. Shadows stretched long across the rafters, turning the low roof into something both protective and a little haunted. It was in these hours, between labor and sleep, that voices rose. Some told stories, legends of saints who battled frost demons, or folk tales where clever peasants outwitted hunger and wolves alike. Others sang, their songs slow and repetitive, more lullaby than performance. Children leaned against mothers, half listening, half already nodding off, their small bodies heavy with exhaustion. Rituals before bed varied, but nearly every family wove some thread of protection into the night. A father might sprinkle a pinch of salt at the doorway, muttering a quiet charm against evil spirits. A mother might tuck a sprig of dried herb into the bedding, lavender in summer, sage in winter, believed to chase away illness or vermin. Crosses were traced over foreheads, over animals, over the very fire itself, as if to wrap the whole hut in invisible armor. Prayer was perhaps the most constant act. Children whispered the words they'd been taught, stumbling over saints' names. Parents prayed more plainly, asking for health, strength, and enough food to last the week. It wasn't just habit. It was survival reframed as devotion. To name fears out loud was to lighten them, to hand them over to something beyond human effort. Then came the slow retreat into bedding. Straw pallets creaked under the weight of bodies pressing close together. Quilts and cloaks were spread wide, each patch, or fur, scrap-tugged and arranged to cover as many limbs as possible. It was a careful negotiation. Too much tugging meant someone froze at the edge. Too little, and the center grew stifling. Children were placed in the middle, parents and elders on the outside, a living shield against drafts. The hut grew quieter, but never silent. Snores rose almost instantly, blending with the sigh of the fire. Animals shifted in their corners, their sounds as familiar as family voices. The smell of smoke, sweat, and damp straw hung heavy, but it was the smell of survival, one every villager carried into their dreams. And soon, sleep came, but not the long, unbroken slumber we know today. Nights were too long for that. Instead, the first sleep would fall quickly, carrying weary bodies into a few hours of rest before the rhythm of wakefulness crept back in. Between the embers and the dark, between prayer and breath, the cycle began again. Midnight often brought with it a strange stirring. The fire, banked low under ash, still pulsed with a faint red glow, but the hut was far from still. One child would roll and mumble, a cousin would rise to cough, or the baby would whimper until soothed against its mother's chest. It wasn't interruption so much as rhythm, a pattern older than memory itself. This was the time between first and second sleep, a pause that peasants accepted as ordinary. Medieval medical texts, in fact, referred to it casually, as if everyone knew that sleep came in two halves. And why wouldn't it? In a world where nights stretched 14 hours or more, who could expect the body to rest without stirring? So families rose, if only briefly. Fathers poked the embers, coaxing them back to life, knowing the hut's survival depended on those coals not dying before dawn. Mothers sometimes used the quiet to mend a torn patch of clothing or tend to a restless animal in the corner. Children rubbed their eyes and whispered, sometimes playing softly, sometimes asking questions that only surfaced in the hush of night. But it wasn't all chores. This in-between time carried a strange intimacy. Couples spoke in low voices, sharing thoughts they hadn't had time for in the blur of day. Older children told stories, often silly or frightening, to keep each other awake a little longer. And sometimes, neighbors sheltering together in the same hut through the coldest months would trade news or gossip in whispers, turning the smoky dark into a makeshift meeting place. Historians debate how widespread this practice truly was. Some argue it was nearly universal across Europe. Others think it varied by region. But whether or not every peasant lived this way, the evidence shows that many did. To them, waking at midnight was neither strange nor disruptive. It was part of life, as natural as eating 2 meals a day or lighting candles at dusk. There was even a belief that dreams after the first sleep were different, closer to truth, more prophetic. A farmer might rise, stoke the fire, and then reflect quietly on what he had dreamed before returning to bed, convinced that the second sleep would carry him deeper into divine meaning. Priests sometimes warned that sinful dreams revealed the soul's weakness, while folktales insisted morning visions promised harvests or storms. Either way, those hours between sleeps became a time for thought, prayer, and reflection. And then, slowly, the second sleep crept in. The fire banked once more, voices quieted, bodies rearranged under the quilt. The hut sank back into a heavier, deeper slumber, closer to the rest we think of today. If the first sleep was for exhaustion, the second was for renewal, Together, they carried families through nights so long and cold that without rhythm, despair might have swallowed them whole. When second sleep finally loosened its grip, it was never gentle. The body woke stiff. The straw mattress compressed flat in places. The smell of smoke, sweat, and damp cloth clinging to every breath. Yet the faintest change in the air signaled it. Dawn was near. A silver light slipped through the cracks in the hut's timber walls, weaker than any candle, but strong enough to remind everyone that night had been endured. Peasants often rose before the sun itself. Work did not wait for comfort. Fathers pushed themselves upright, rubbing sore shoulders, already thinking of the woodpile or the animals outside shivering in their pens. Mothers sat up slowly, brushing straw from their hair, reaching instinctively for the children still buried under the quilt. Babies whimpered as if sensing the shift, while older siblings muttered, reluctant to leave warmth for the bitter draft seeping through the door. For families like this, dawn was less about relief than about duty. Water had to be drawn, often through ice. Goats and cows needed milking, chickens needed feeding, and if the snow was deep, pathways had to be cleared before any step could be taken. Medieval chronicles describe peasants greeting the new day not with feasts or songs, but with a whispered blessing. Thanks for surviving another night. It was instinctive, not ceremonial, spoken the way one might sigh after lifting a heavy weight. Inside the hut, blankets were folded back, and the patchwork quilt revealed its patched seams, damp from breath and sweat. No one lingered long beneath it, because the warmth that had been shared all night quickly faded once bodies scattered. Children tugged at wool cloaks or slipped into stiff, half-frozen shoes. Parents reached for tools, cloaks, and whatever scraps of bread or porridge could be scraped together before work began. Even the animals sensed the change. The pig grunted, rooting in straw for scraps. Hens rustled, impatient for grain. If there was a rooster, and many huts kept one, it crowed, muffled but certain. Its call not just a signal to wake, but, in folk belief, a banisher of evil spirits. Some said its crow split the night in two, chasing away frost hags and wolves alike. And in that sound, peasants felt reassured that light had triumphed once more. Historians remind us that morning was no miracle. Hunger still gnawed, work still loomed, and the cold still bit hard. But dawn carried psychological weight. It meant the hut had stood against the storm. It meant the family had endured. In a world where every night felt endless, every morning was a small victory. And so the cycle repeated. Nights of fear and cold, days of labor and survival. Yet within that rhythm, there was resilience. Dawn always came, even when it felt impossibly far away. And so, friends, we reached the quiet end of this long winter's tale. We've stepped into a medieval hut, felt the weight of patched quilts, heard the restless coughs, smelled the smoke and straw, and lived through the endless nights that pressed on families centuries ago. It wasn't comfort that kept them alive, but resilience, cooperation, and the stubborn will to endure. Every ember in the hearth, every whispered prayer, every shared breath under that quilt was a defiance against the cold. When dawn finally came, it wasn't about warmth or plenty. It was about survival. Families rose stiff and weary, but they rose, and that simple act of waking, of greeting the gray light after another brutal night, was proof that hope could outlast hardship. So as you lay down tonight, remember the peasants of those long winters. Their nights were darker, colder, harsher than anything most of us will ever know. Yet they endured, night after night, season after season, until spring softened the world again. Let that thought be your comfort. No night is endless, no winter eternal. Dawn always waits, even when it feels impossibly far away. Thank you for staying with me through this journey into the past. If you enjoyed traveling back in time together, don't forget to give this video a like and hit follow for more stories. And now, I'll leave you with this. Pull your own blanket close, breathe deep, and let the quiet carry you. Good night, my friends. Sleep well.